Some of the very first Disney animators in the 1920s and early 1930s came out of the world of newspaper comics, illustration, and advertising. This was true throughout the animation industry. Many early animators attempted to create a type of moving comic strip on the screen, sometimes using popular characters from newspaper comics. Today, popular animated movies might spin off comic books, but back in the 1920s, the opposite was true. Newspaper syndicates saw animation as a promotional vehicle to increase readership in daily papers. But as animation expanded at the Disney studio, Walt quickly looked beyond the conceit of moving comics. In the 1930s, Walt looked for ways to advance animation into a type of moving art, with short cartoons such as The Old Mill, and with early features such as Snow White and Fantasia. To create these films, Walt looked more to artists with classical training. Basically, he looked to men and women who had formal training in art school to adapt their skills to fit the growing field of studio animation. In ways, Walt was assisted by the Great Depression, because in the early to mid-1930s, artists graduating from art school had few prospects outside of advertising, Hollywood, and animation. From the mid-1930s forward, the Disney studio became an enclave of classically trained artists. At the studio, animators, background painters, and other artists held exhibits of their own non-studio art. Starting in the 1940s, the studio library was regularly converted into a gallery to present the fine art of one or a group of studio artists. Outside of the studio, some animators and background painters exhibited their personal work at museums and galleries. Even when live-action art directors joined the Disney effort to create Disneyland, these new recruits tended to be artists with classical training, such as Herb Ryman, who was trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, Harper Goff, who studied at the Chouinard Art Institute, and Sam McKim, who studied at Art Center in Pasadena. Throughout the twin enterprises of the studio and WED, most artists at Disney were familiar with art history and how recent movements such as Impressionism, Naturalism, and Modernism created a context for sophisticated animation and deeply engaging themed areas. At times, Walt spent part of his weekly TV show to explain how the traditions of art shaped his studio. The best-known example of this is a segment called Four Artists Paint One Tree.
Here at the studio, we have many artists who have achieved national reputation as painters, in addition to their accomplishments in the field of animation. These men know the value of Henri's advice to be yourself. I'd like you to meet four of them and see how they put this rule into practice.
In this segment, Walt discusses how an artist, using his or her unique vision, sense of expression, and personal technique, can represent the same tree in four distinct canvases. The four Disney artists are character animator Mark Davis, background painter and art director Ivan Earle, effects animator Josh Meador, and background painter and color stylist Walt Paragoy. All four started their careers in animation, though Mark Davis and Walt Paragoy eventually shifted over to theme park design. Ivan Earle and Josh Meador also contributed to Disneyland, but only in minor ways. But in this TV segment from 1958, the focus of all of their professional work was still tied to animation. They were all attached to the same studio, but in this episode, they were each working to showcase the individuality of their vision.
Here now, on a Saturday, our four artists take a busman's holiday. On this particular day, the subject that attracts their interest is a fine old live oak. You'll notice that even in the operation of setting up, there is an individual approach.
The segment itself focuses on how these four artists transform the subject of the tree into unique paintings. What's not mentioned in the episode is that this experiment, four male artists painting outdoors to explore how their vision produces a unique painting, was, in ways, a reenactment of one of the most famous art history events of the 19th century, when a group of male artists in France together ventured outside of Paris to paint the landscape, sometimes with their easels set side by side. Among these artists were Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and Sisley. In 1869 and 1870, they traveled by train to the countryside to the west of Paris, to towns and leisure areas not far from Versailles. Though in previous years, many of these artists had been attached to the master painter Edouard Manet and his studio, they were now venturing out on their own to discover how their vision, brushstrokes, and use of color could transform the same piece of countryside into a unique landscape. In particular, Monet and Renoir spent time in the small town of Bougival, where they explored how their visions for paintings, though using the same subject, were unique. They were joined later in this region by Pissarro and Sisley. The goal of their work wasn't necessarily to create the best painting, but for Monet to create a painting that was most uniquely done in the style of Monet, for Renoir to create a painting that was most uniquely done in the style of Renoir. It was a unique project outside of a studio to transform a landscape through vision. Sometimes with their easels set side by side, they painted landscapes, images of town, and visions of Parisians visiting the parks and ponds. In September of 1869, for example, Monet and Renoir both created paintings of a boating and swimming resort on the Seine River called La Grenouille. Monet even wrote about this experience. Quote, "I do have a dream of painting the baths at La Grenouille, for which I have made some bad sketches," he said. "But it's only a dream. Renoir, who has just spent 2 months here, also wants to do this painting." In a side-by-side comparison, anyone can see that the underlying subject of the two canvases are the same, yet the presentation holds stark differences, differences that are attributed to the vision of each artist. This period is often referred to as the cradle of Impressionism, a period in which artists didn't look for subjects to communicate a unique vision so much as for unique presentation to communicate how they saw the world. Surely the four Disney artists, as they ventured out from the studio to paint the same tree, understood that they, in their own way, were reenacting the summer of 1869, when those Parisian artists, Monet, Renoir, and others, more firmly established their own style. Only this reenactment was done now in the world of Hollywood studio artists. This dance between the history of art and the creation of Disney projects takes place in various ways throughout the 20th century. It was there when Disney artists worked on Snow White and Fantasia. It was there when those four artists painted a tree for the weekly Disney TV series, the four of them together reenacting early experiments with Impressionism in the hills behind the studio lot. And it was carried by Disney artists forward as they moved from film production into theme park design. One way to understand the Disney parks is to look at them through the lens of art history, as the historical traditions of art informed how many Disney artists approached their work. Today on our podcast, something different. If you're a regular over at the theme parks, you've probably walked down Main Street dozens if not hundreds of times. You already know about the tribute windows and out in California, that little apartment above the firehouse. So today we'll talk about some new ways to experience the Main Street area at the Magic Kingdom. Not so much new details to find, but new ways to look at the park as you move through it. Some perspectives that are tied to the history of art, which was a familiar subject for nearly everyone who originally designed the Disney parks. Let's start with this, the kinetics of the opening scene. Most people take the monorail to the Magic Kingdom, but I would argue that the ferry across Seven Seas Lagoon offers the most visually interesting presentation of the entrance plaza. Between the opening of Disneyland and the opening of Walt Disney World, Walt's artists came to better understand how to capture the public's imagination in themed space. By the 1960s, Imagineers understood that Kinetics more effectively captured the eye of guests than static set designs, which was an artistic strategy that was transferred from Disneyland to the Magic Kingdom. If you're standing at the front of the ferry and look out across the water, you'll find the Magic Kingdom offers a lovely presentation of layered kinetics, that is, rows of movement, one stacked on top of the other. On the bottom level are the boats. On the ground are the people. On a slightly elevated plateau is the railroad, and above the railroad is a beamway. Each of these layers is visually distinct and even separated by color. The boats are on a field of blue. The trains right above an expanse of green. The people are walking across salmon-colored cement, and the monorail rides on a white-toned beam. Motion happens from left to right and from right to left. And maybe, to get the full effect here, you need to imagine the Magic Kingdom back in 1971 when it first opened, without the shade covers, without the elevated gangplanks recently constructed to load guests directly onto the second story of the ferries, but back when the resort with lower crowds offered clean views of the theme park from the water. There's even a visual story offered in this tableau, a history of mechanical transportation in America. On the lowest level, the water, are the boats, which are the oldest form of transportation here. On the ground, on that green elevated rise, is the next oldest form, the steam train. And up in the air on the beamway is the form meant to represent the future, the monorail. From water to land to air. From distant past to recent past to the near future. And these time frames also foreshadow themes inside the Magic Kingdom, from Frontierland to Main Street to Tomorrowland. That is, again, from distant past to near past to the future. It's these types of connections that not only make this park visually engaging, but also give it a sense of depth and layered meaning. Main Street, both in California and in Florida, is a work of genius in how it transitions us from the world outside the park to the world inside the park. One way to think about art is its level of realism and its level of imagination. Specifically, to what level does a work of art represent the real world, and to what level does it represent an imaginative vision of the artist? All areas in Disney parks are a blend of real-world inspiration and imaginative elements, so this is a question of proportions. In the Magic Kingdom, the most popular and famous land, Fantasyland, I would say holds the largest level of imagination. That is, this is a space that is furthest from a real-world environment. Main Street, however, is the closest to a real-world environment. Main Street at the Magic Kingdom even draws some of its cultural designs and color palettes from turn-of-the-century architectural designs on the East Coast. The train station, for example, adapts design elements from a station in Saratoga Springs, New York. These real-world influences are adapted and designed to create something new in the park. But the design of Main Street has the largest connection to spaces outside the park. In this way, Main Street is designed to transition us away from the world we know outside of the park into other lands that have a higher degree of fantasy and play. Likewise, at the end of the day, Main Street transitions us out of those realms of fantasy back to that more familiar world on the other side of the parking lot. The Magic Kingdom is largely a set of landscapes, mostly modeled after movie genres such as the Western, the period drama, the Tarzan-style adventure, and so on. Visually, what makes a Disney park are its artistic landscapes, landscapes that are often presented as visions by themselves. But in terms of art history, specifically the history of painting, we are in a fairly contemporary space when we think about landscape as the subject for a work of art. A landscape presented by itself in a painting is a somewhat recent development. There are a few, and only a few, landscape paintings in Renaissance arts. There are, of course, landscapes in Renaissance paintings, but they almost always include figures, usually in the foreground, which is the focus of the composition. At the Magic Kingdom, guests rarely are the subject. What is the artistic subject at the Magic Kingdom? Well, it's the background, the environment, the sense of place. And that concept, too, that a vision of place by itself can be a type of art, is a recent cultural development. It's likely that you have lived many different places in your lifetime. One place in your youth, another at college or when you were a young adult, and another now. You've likely also visited many regions on vacation. With travel comes a greater understanding as to how place affects us. And this type of life experience shapes how we understand our emotional relationship to the environment. The Magic Kingdom is, at its center, a collection of landscapes that ask us to understand how we relate to our environment. And in the development of art, these types of questions, how does a viewer relate only to landscape, are fairly recent, rising in the 1700s and then continuing with greater prominence to the present day. That is, these questions were asked more often as leisure travel became more common, something that has increased up until the present day with our modern mobile society. And along with this, the idea of movement and relating to new environments is also a very American concept. Unless you're Native American, your ancestors were movers. They left their home country and moved to America, perhaps for economic advantage or political freedom. And once they were here, in New York or Boston or San Francisco, they likely moved again to a less populated region to find better opportunities. In these experiences, intuitively, your ancestors understood how different environments created within them different emotional or psychological moods. This experience of movement and connection with new environments was replicated by their children and grandchildren, and so on. Disney World is, at its most basic level, a series of environments that we, as guests, experience relatively quickly, in which a visit asks us to create an emotional connection to a new artistic space every 15 minutes or so. And this is perhaps one of the most postmodern elements of a Disney resort, an experience where the landscape art around us changes every few minutes. Think of this as travel on steroids. At noon, you might be in Frontierland. At 12:15, you might be behind a medieval castle in Fantasyland. And later in the day, you might even be in Galaxy's Edge. But let's loop back to Main Street. And also, let's click into some Main Street music as we consider how the view down Main Street is laid out literally like a painting. If you stand at Town Square and look down Main Street toward the castle, the view represents the classic presentation of a landscape painting with one-point focus. In painting, this is called linear perspective. Paintings arrange themselves at times cleanly, with geometric lines and visual balance to suggest scale and depth. But this same level of neatness is rarely seen in person without visual disruption out in the real world. So if you were standing at Town Square looking down toward the castle, assuming the street was mostly empty, you'd see a horizon line. Typically for artists, this is mostly an imaginary line. Here down Main Street, the horizon line is an actual line that ends Main Street, a line beyond which it is not easy to make out small details, a line also, in this case, that separates the ground from the sky. In paintings, depth is arranged through the use of orthogonal lines. These are typically parallel lines that start out wide and then gradually move together to suggest depth. There are orthogonal lines consciously worked into Main Street, which allows this space, from this perspective, to exist in the familiar terms of a painting. The most notable orthogonals are the curbs. The curbs, if you're standing in the center of town square, are straight parallel lines that seem to narrow as they move down the street, but there's others. There's the streetcar tracks, there's the lines of lampposts, and more or less there's the building line and the line of the rooftops. All of these lines, if you extend them in your imagination, converge on the horizon line at a single point. In a painting, the place where these lines meet is called the vanishing point. Here, as you look down Main Street, as you follow the narrowing line of curbs and the buildings, and then imagine where the curbs, if they kept narrowing, would meet the horizon line, you'd find the vanishing point. At the Magic Kingdom, the vanishing point is the exact spot where the castle emerges in the distance. That is, the lines of orthogonals draw our attention specifically to the castle. In this, the park is using the traditions of painting to direct our eyes and then our feet to the castle. I've seen this question come up on fan boards, the question of why are most main streets, regardless of the type of park, whether it be a regional park like in California or a larger resort park like in Florida, roughly the same length. Essentially, why is the Main Street in Florida a park that can hold over 100,000 people just as long as the Main Street in Anaheim, which overall is designed to hold far less? And this, at least in part, is the answer. The streets need to have roughly the same proportions to have the orthogonals meet at the vanishing point that blends into the castle. If the street was significantly longer or significantly shorter, some of the painterliness of the space would disappear, and the vision wouldn't relate as strongly to how things are arranged traditionally in art. You would feel instead more like you're standing on a regular city street. Another way to work through the park is to notice how architecture is presented, which structures are combined and which are isolated. This is also something that in small ways touches on the history of art and how paintings have been presented. In modern museums, we're used to seeing individual canvases arranged on a wall with a lot of space around them, so that we examine each painting as a unique creation. But in the 19th century, paintings were typically framed, then arranged in groups on a common wall, side by side, one on top of the other, so that viewers would encounter them in clusters and notice how paintings together created a dialogue. Museums still do this at times so visitors can see how canvases were intended to be displayed in the era in which they were painted. But most contemporary museums isolate paintings with distance, with the idea that each work has a unique meaning and should be considered separately. The Disney parks are a combination of the so-called stacked and isolated approaches for the images inside the parks. The images on Main Street are mostly stacked, which is another way of saying grouped or combined. Just look at any block on Main Street. The shop facades blend from one to another. The confectionery merges into the cinema, which then merges into the old watch shop. These shops are meant to be viewed together as a unit, but once you get to the end of Main Street, the castle is isolated, giving its presentation unique importance. It's framed in ways by the sky, with no other structures merging into its space. This is one of the ways that the park forces visitors to take in a vista as though it's touched with particular importance. Each of the four parks has at least one architectural icon presented in isolation from other structures: the castle, Spaceship Earth, Hollywood Tower, and the Tree of Life. There's some other structures that fall generally under this rubric, such as Main Street Station and the Mexico Pavilion at World Showcase. The castle, Spaceship Earth, Hollywood Tower, and Tree of Life, however, are the major ones. But there's more in terms of visual design happening here in regards to the history of art. Most of these structures in outline conform to the Renaissance ideal of an equilateral triangle in terms of their general shape. The castle, with its high center point and wide ends, presents that triangular outline. Same for Spaceship Earth, so long as you include its base to complete the legs of the triangle. Also, the Tree of Life mostly has this form, so long as you connect up its lower branches with imaginary lines to the ground. You can also find obvious triangles at Big Thunder and Splash Mountain in the rise of their mountain icons. The only such park icon without a triangular silhouette is the Tower of Terror, which is probably one of the least identifiable icons in the skyline of the Florida parks. When Hollywood Studios was designed decades ago, the tower wasn't intended as that park's landmark. In fact, it wasn't even built until 5 years after the park opened. Unlike the icons at other Disney parks, the architectural icon at the Studios Park has shifted multiple times, from Grauman's Chinese Theater to the Sorcerer's Hat to the Eiffel Tower, and once the Water Tower was removed in 2016, to the Tower of Terror. The Studios Park has never had an enduring architectural icon, in part because the design conceit for each of these attempts differs widely from the design conceit for icons at the other three parks. Even Typhoon Lagoon has an architectural icon that fits the design mode of the other three parks. At Typhoon Lagoon, you'll find the familiar triangular rise of Mount Mayday, topped off with a wrecked ship that is named Miss Tully's. That icon has endured for over 30 years, from the park's opening in 1989 until the present. So if, by chance, you're thinking of designing your own park, you might keep in mind that, at least at the Florida Resort, the most successful and enduring architectural icons have been isolated, that is, framed widely by sky, and in terms of shape, conforming generally to the Renaissance ideal of an equilateral triangle. One area on Main Street we haven't looked at yet are the named windows. These windows commemorate the people who designed, built, and added to the Magic Kingdom. I'm sure that most of you already know about the named windows on the upper stories of Main Street. Often these named windows are viewed through the lens of cinema, like film credits that viewers see at the start of a film. But from an art history perspective, there might be a different and perhaps more meaningful way to read these windows. In 1827, the painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres presented a masterwork called The Apotheosis of Homer, which was a painting focused on the historical figure of Homer, an ancient Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Ingres' painting was enormous, 16 feet by 12 feet. In the painting, Homer sits before a Greek temple where he is being crowned by a winged figure, typically interpreted as the father of the classical tradition. Around Homer are 45 figures who were influenced by ideas that originated with him, from his contemporaries like Virgil and Sophocles to later artists and leaders like Alexander the Great, Dante, Shakespeare, and Molière. The painting depicts then not only how Homer changed his own time, but also it depicts how his intellectual heirs carried on his classical ideas far beyond his death. From a certain perspective, the same is true on Main Street. Sure, the windows are a list of credits for those who contributed to the Magic Kingdom, but the thematic structure of Ingres' painting can also be seen on Main Street. At the end of Main Street is the figure of Walt, raised on a podium at the hub, sort of like the figure of Homer in the painting. But then around him, up and down both sides of Main Street, are not only the first generation of heirs, those people who carried Walt's ideas after his death from California to Florida, like Dick Irvine, Bill Martin, and Claude Coates, but also a second generation of heirs who never met Walt, who carried his ideas passed on from earlier designers and managers to regions that Walt never imagined. Among this group are people such as George Kalogridis, who was hired years after Walt's passing. Seen from this perspective, the windows just aren't credits, but a roadmap depicting how ideas originating with Walt moved through decades after his death, passed from one generation of designers and managers to subsequent generations. It's more like a family tree, or a painting that showcases how the traditions of classicalism started with Homer and moved through centuries down to writers such as Shakespeare. As we're moving toward the end of our art history tour down Main Street, I want to step briefly into Cinderella Castle, which is meant to represent a medieval structure. Inside, you'll find a set of mosaic murals that retell the story of Cinderella, designed by Dorothea Redmond and arranged into tiles and assembled by Hans Joachim Scharf. Cinderella Castle is meant to represent a medieval castle, and religious murals, somewhat like this, were a popular form of medieval art. But here's something interesting to notice. The figures in Dorothea Redmond's mural, Cinderella, the prince, the sisters, and so on, don't have the flatness of medieval art, but instead the overall presentation has linear depth and perspective found only in later art. The line sizing and scale in each are consistent to have been developed with later concepts of linear perspective. These ideas allow an artist to create the illusion of visual depth, even though the mosaic is two-dimensional. This is a concept that wasn't solidified into European art until after the 15th century. After the medieval period, some early Renaissance masters even got scale and perspective wrong. But for modern viewers, artistic depictions without linear depth look unsophisticated, and so Dorothea Redmond has combined elements of medieval art with later conventions to create a mosaic that has enough of the flavors of medieval art to suggest that time period. Next time you're in the castle, look first at the flatness of the figures. That's a medieval sensibility. And then look for visual depth. In many of the mosaics, you'll even find obvious orthogonal lines to define how depth is expressed in the image. Those elements just weren't developed consistently into European art until many years after the medieval period was over. And that, I think, as you continue through the Magic Kingdom, is a way to think about art history and this park. Designers, most of whom had a firm grasp of art history, continually combined elements relating to the history of art with contemporary elements and even modern technology. The Magic Kingdom is a blending together of visual elements old and new to create unique viewing experiences, images that are firmly tied to our collective cultural history, but are also expressed in a way that makes them feel fresh, as though they are also joined to the movements of our contemporary lives. But to conclude this tour, the final works I want to consider in the Magic Kingdom are two statues created by Disney artist and Imagineer Blaine Gibson. The first is the Partner statue. This features Walt and Mickey and is displayed at the Hub. Walt died in 1966, during the Civil Rights Movement, during the period of free expression, and in terms of pop culture, during the time of the TV shows Bewitched, Batman, and I Dream of Jeannie. But his statue makes him appear as though he belongs to an older period of history, even though he is dressed in the correct clothes for a studio executive in the mid-1960s. The trick here, I think, has to do with the pedestal at the base of the statue. Most contemporary sculpture is presented at ground level without the elevation of a pedestal. Michelangelo's David is on a pedestal. Rodin's The Thinker is usually on a pedestal. Even the Statue of Liberty is on a pedestal. The pedestal fell out of artistic favor in sculpture in the late 1800s, and most contemporary sculpture, including sculpture from Walt's lifetime, was not arranged on pedestals. But by including the pedestal for the Partner statue, the artist Blaine Gibson is asking us to look at Walt as though he is tied to older periods of history. It's a trick in how the work is staged rather than how the figures are composed. The pedestal also ties this work to the period of Main Street, the late 1800s or the early 1900s. In this, the statue heroizes Walt. Viewers are looking up at Walt, who is elevated on a pedestal. Walt is arranged to be admired. And the interesting thing here is that this is not the only statue that Blaine Gibson sculpted for Main Street. The Partner statue was unveiled in 1993, but in 1999, Blaine Gibson also presented a statue of Walt's brother, Roy Disney, the financial genius of the company, on Main Street as well. Roy's statue is called Sharing the Magic. It is usually in the center of Town Square at the other end of Main Street, though depending on park needs, it has been moved briefly to other locations. In terms of the presentation of the figure, Gibson has presented Roy in a different relationship to viewers. There is no pedestal, and as such, Roy's statue very much feels like part of the 20th century. The statue is not elevated, and as a result, Roy is not heroized. Roy is seated on a bench, meaning that as you walk up to him, you look down at his figure. He is extremely approachable, particularly as the space beside him on the bench remains open, inviting you to sit beside him. You can actually do that and have your picture taken there. The statue of Walt is presented next to Mickey. Both of these figures have their weight arranged on one leg, allowing them to lean toward each other, creating a complete composition, an iconic pose of two figures in relationship to each other. But in direct contrast is the statue of Roy, who is featured on a bench next to Minnie, but the last spot on the bench remains open, waiting for you to sit down and complete the picture. In this, Blaine Gibson presents two very different sentiments about the two founders of the Disney Empire. Walt is the hero artist, elevated above and separated from the crowds, while Roy is casually seated on a bench, a quiet man enjoying the park with others, a park that his financial planning helped create. Probably more than anything else, since the two works were created by the same person, it depicts how Gibson viewed Roy Disney as a different type of personality compared with Walt Disney. He knew both men, as did many early Imagineers. Marty Sklar, another early Imagineer, once described Roy and Walt in the following way, quote, "Roy was such a father figure in a lot of ways. This company needs somebody who is approachable and you could talk to him. You couldn't make small talk with Walt, but you could make small talk with Roy." A similar sentiment is conveyed visually in Blaine Gibson's two statues. For Gibson, Roy is presented as approachable. You can sit down right next to him. But Walt and his ideas are presented as outside our reach. He's up there on a podium like a statue of Abraham Lincoln. As the statue is presented, we could never stand next to him. We are always looking up with a type of admiration, as though Walt's ideas and perspective are slightly outside of our grasp, hovering in a realm that even now we can only partially approach. Art here is not just creating a pleasing visual, it's creating a message that conveys how one early Disney artist understood the differences between the two men who founded the Disney Company. Next time you are at the Florida resort, take the ferry over to the Magic Kingdom and look at the kinetic layers that depict the history of American transportation across the entrance plaza. Keep track of which buildings are visually stacked and which are isolated. Notice those orthogonals along Main Street. And look at the differences between the partner statue and sharing the magic. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a regular visitor to the parks. And this episode hopefully has given you a few new ways to look at the parks next time you visit, so the experience of visiting the Magic Kingdom stays fresh and interesting. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. One more thing. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. In recent months, we have explored the opening of Disney World. We've looked at the life of John Hench. We've uncovered a lost interview with Ward Kimball. We've looked at the history of the Jungle Cruise. And we've offered in-depth stories about the creation of Adventures Campus and events related to the 50th anniversary of Walt Disney World. Hopefully, these episodes have given you new ways to appreciate the world of theme parks and film. If you enjoy these episodes, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to join is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.